Thank you so much for being here on a rainy day in Abuja. Thank you to our students who are also joining us online. My name is Aniekeme Umo. I'm Vice President of Operations at Miva Open University. Welcome to another masterclass at Miva. Today we have the honor of a distinguished guest in our midst, the Honourable Commissioner for Finance of Ekiti State, Akintunde Oyebode.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Aki is the Honourable Commissioner for Finance and Economic Development of Ekiti State. Prior to that, he was a special advisor on investment, trade, and innovation, also for Ekiti State. He was also the Director General of Ekiti State Development and Investment Promotion Agency. And even before that, he worked at the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund as the Pioneer Executive Secretary. We just had a conversation with a colleague of ours who said his impact is still being felt in Lagos to today. And truly that's the case. He supported the creation of over 100,000 jobs in 3 years in Lagos, leading to very verifiable reduction in Lagos State's unemployment rate, despite at the time, and even now, an increase in unemployment across the nation. So we are very honored to have Akin here with us today to discuss, budgeting for development using Ekiti State as a case study. So thank you, Akin, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Yeah.
Icebreaker.
Yeah.
So if you could snap your finger today, right, and allocate a significant portion of the budget to a specific development project in Ekiti State, what project would you choose and why?
One project.
One, just one.
Because it's one project, it will probably be just broadband, improving broadband penetration.
Okay.
Why? Because today, just access to broadband allows us to resolve multiple development issues. So if you're thinking, so ordinarily I'd have said, for me, it's always a conversation about human capital development, right? And it's usually around two anchors, healthcare and education, right? But broadband, I think, helps you solve multiple issues, right? So it cheapens the cost of education, increases access to education with things like telemedicine, etc. It allows for broader healthcare coverage and reduces the spend and investment in brick and mortar, intervention. So for me, it will be access to broadband, apart from, of course, then the economic benefits of that, which is then allowing people to work remotely,
Right.
etc. So for me, I think it will be first just deepening broadband penetration in the States.
That makes sense. It's like a horizontal that affects every
Correct.
single vertical.
Yeah.
That's cool. So the way the masterclass works is, I have some questions. We have our students here in person. They'll probably have questions at the end of this. And we have students joining online. We'll give them an opportunity to ask questions also. I know that you also have some slides. So if after or during the questions you want to present something in the slide, we can definitely do that as well.
Okay.
All right, cool. So we're talking about how state budgets are structured, how they run. So first question, how is a state's budget even structured?
It's a very interesting question because we're currently going through a budget review process in the state. So what tends to happen, I can speak for my state, and what should happen is that budgeting starts from a consultative session, right? So usually the governor or whoever leads the government comes to government with a vision of what they want to do, right? That vision should be contained in a manifesto of sorts, right? So when someone says, hey, I want to be governor, you should ask, why do you want to be governor? What's your vision? What are you bringing to us? Because remember, building society is all about building hope. It's all about hope in the future, right? It's all about, we think we're here because we think we'll be better off here tomorrow, right? So you've got to say, look, what is your grand vision as a leader? That vision comes in a manifesto of sorts. So if you take Ekiti today, what I have here are 6 pillars, right? But the vision of the government is to develop a state of shared prosperity, right? And where does that come from? It comes from the acknowledgement that, I like to say, and I'm sure, you guys will know, that we have the highest number of professors per capita across the country. I don't think that's in debate, right? And anyone who wants to debate it, I always say, in my family, there are 3 professors, right? That's just one family. So you can, expand that for the state. But that thirst and love for knowledge hasn't translated into economic prosperity for the people. Because what you find is that the best of us will leave Ekiti and migrate to Lagos, Abuja, outside Nigeria, etc. So we're almost like a Lebanon, where the diaspora community is much more prosperous than the domestic community. So the vision of shared prosperity is really saying, I want people to stay here and be prosperous here, right? That vision then leads to what you might call pillars or an agenda and whatnot. So we then say, okay, we're going to do this governance, human capital development, infrastructure, youth development, job creation, agri and food security, arts, culture, and tourism. So those are the things that, it doesn't mean you're not going to do other things. Doesn't mean you're not going to build other things, but those are the things that you are very passionate about. Right. So that then says, so that's your sort of like your North Star. That determines the direction of travel. When you do that, you then say, look, how much resources do we have, right? Now, in our case, we don't plan on an annual basis, right? So we've done a 30-year development plan, right? So 2022 to 2051, right? This is where we are. This is the Ekiti of the future, which means if you come in today as governor, part of the visioning has been done for you, right? You can go there and amend certain things. You can review, 5 years prior to say, was this correct? Have we done this correctly? What do I want to tweak? But there's a general sense of this is the development agenda for the state, right? Now, within that 30-year development plan, when you come in as governor, you then say, I have a 4-year block. What do I want to achieve in those 4 years, right? What are the resources that we have as a state, right? What do I want to achieve on an annual basis? Is there a gap between the resources and our aspiration? And can we plug that gap through some sustainable fundraising, whether it's grants, whether it's concessionary loans or commercial loans, right? So on one side is you have your aspirations, right? On another side, you have the resources, which limits you. Now, what tends to happen sometimes is that as a politician, right, with a 4-year calendar, you're in a hurry. And so you want to do as much as possible, but you also can't overextend yourself, because then future governments will pay for your impatience. So you then say, look, we have, let's say for argument's sake, 200 billion, right? We then go out and say, what are the most important things we can do in this year? So we have a sense of what are the capital projects, and what are your constraints. So you always have binding constraints. In our case, it will be your workforce, pensions, etc. That's not going anywhere, right? So you know that you have to pay those. So when you do all of that, you then go out to the community to say, guys, this is our grand plan, but you are the people. And we often discount the wisdom of the crowds. We think these people don't know anything about governance, we're smarter than them. But it's a big misnomer. So when you go in there, we do these sessions now on a senatorial basis. We used to do them per local government, but it's just too difficult logistics-wise now.
Because there's too many?
It will take too long.
Okay.
Right? So we bring people now, we cluster them, bring them, so the 5 local governments or 6 local governments that form a senatorial district will converge. Okay. And then you all come to talk about what you want to see. So from there, you get people saying, our priority is potable water. Some people say, hey, our priority is connecting this road, this town to this town, right? Because there's a large, movement of goods and people, right? So you also use that to refine your ideas, right? And then at the end of the day, you come up with a plan, right, that says this is what we're spending on. But it's important to always note one thing. Nigerians always like this whole capital versus recurrent budget conversation, right? And what people often forget is that if you budget today to build a new hospital, right, building and equipping the hospital is part of your capital budget. But it has a recurrent, right, consequence, because you're going to staff that hospital with people. You're going to buy, electricity, consumables, etc. Those things all form part of your recurring budget. So I always say, look, guys, let's be less concerned about a capital versus recurrent splits, but be more interested in the substance of what the state is trying to achieve. Yeah, so I hope that's a long-winded summary of how we budget.
No, that was really, really insightful. I hearing this, I don't know if this is specific to Ekiti State, but budgeting with a longer term horizon, that 30-year plan, I think that that's really important. And then it's sort of you're looking at your 4-year chunk within the grand scope of. Do you know if that's Ekiti specific?
It's not. I mean, Kaduna has a development plan. I believe Nasarawa has one. Lagos definitely has one. Within the Southwest, I'll say maybe Oyo has one. So a number of states, work with, and actually this work is even done now. Development partners, as you can imagine, are also now very interested, in this kind of work. So they also support states who are interested in long-term planning. It's a thing where we don't believe in it because Nigeria has had a number of failed development plans, right? But the problem is that I'll always tell people that, look, you can't contextualize planning within, military, for example, within the military era. What plans do you want to make, right? Someone wakes up, you wake up at 7 a.m., there's martial music, and someone says, fellow Nigerians, right? And that's that, the plan is done, right? So a democratic government allows you more room for planning. But I think what we probably need today is a broader national plan. Right? And something that says this is the Nigerian consensus of what we all want from the country, and then subnationals can feed off that. But in the absence of what is a grand national plan, the subnationals have started to do their own long-term plan of how they want to develop within the context of the broader federal system.
Makes sense. So, I mean, these projects, you already touched on it a little bit, they require quite a bit of capital, right? How is Ekiti diversifying its revenue sources to fund all of that?
It'll sound like we're bragging a bit here, but if you look at the latest JTB reports, right, we're the fastest growing states, right? I mean, you can argue that we're growing from a much smaller base, right? But again, 80% IGR growth. Actually, they say 75. Our internal numbers say 83, but what's 8% between friends? But our numbers, look, we've done a number of interesting things. The first thing is we realize that, look, people talk about IGR in isolation. IGR is a consequence of prior investments and development, internally generated revenue. So that's effectively revenues that a state or a jurisdiction generates and collects. In fact, it's not really generated, it's what it's allowed to collect by the Constitution. And so I'm a bit pissed off this morning. So, we'll have a conversation about federalism. Because there's a misnomer. When people say IGR, etc., you're not collecting that much. You go to Abuja to go and beg. So when people come and say, oh, you've gone to FAC to go and beg for money, I say to them, there's a lot of ignorance here because we don't beg. The federating units is where all the economic activity takes place in Nigeria, right? So if we had fiscal federalism, everybody will hold what is generated within their units, right? So think about MTN. MTN will pay taxes, corporate taxes to the federal government. But those taxes come from data, voice, SMS activities that happen in Lagos, in Kafanchan, in Ado-Ekiti, in Ishayin, in anywhere else, Guashiuku, anywhere else, right? Those people don't have control over those resources. The resources that come from those, they go into a federal port and they get redistributed. So IGR for us is really what we're allowed to collect, right? Now, within the context of that, you also have to say, look, if you don't invest enough, right, IGR is not going to grow from taxing people to death, right? So you have to expand the base. Now, we recognize in Ekiti that there are two things that we have to do concurrently. One is, of course, invest in the future so that people can be more prosperous and pay more, but also ensure that we don't see too many leakages today. So what did we do? We first said, look, the Internal Revenue Service, you're fully autonomous. We don't interfere in what you do. The chairman is executive, right? When we're hiring our chairman, we ask KPMG, right, to give us a list of candidates. had a full-on assessment center, right? We picked the best candidates. He didn't know anybody. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't someone's uncle or someone's brother. The first day I met him was at his interview. The first day he met the governor was after he had been appointed, right? So nobody brought you, right? So there's no uncle coming to say, oh, don't remove that guy because he's my brother. No. So we told him, we said, look, the way you've gotten in on merits is the way we'll exit you if you don't perform, right? That's one. Two is we said, look, you 10% of what you collect, you will take to run your office. You can pay better salaries. You can pay better bonuses, right? You can invest in the infrastructure you need, right? And we've seen the outcome. The outcome is a 75% jump in revs. The second thing is we've also laid a lot more technology onto this, right? So 5 years ago, it was difficult to, pay taxes electronically, to do your assessments. You had to go into an office, etc. Today, you can do these things, from the click of a button, right? So we've also enhanced the ease of, payment and assessment. So those things help in improving, just the revenue base, right? So that's what we do to grow IGR. Of course, as you then see more development, right, you'll see that those numbers will continue to grow. So for us, our aspiration is to first say the internally generated revenues must cover our payroll, right? And for me, that's the test of an efficient workforce.
This is the government's payroll, or
the government's payroll.
Okay.
So if you are working in the government, you need to be able to pay yourselves.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it covers our recurrent expenditure. Right? So payroll plus overheads. So not only are you paying yourself, you are paying to keep the lights on, you are paying for, all your consumables, etc. And then at some point, we hope to get to a place where it then covers our entire budget, where anything that comes from the federation is then an add-on, right? You could argue that in today's Nigeria, Lagos is the only state that is close to that, right? But again, we're now at a place where from 15% of our revenues, IGR is now covering about 35% of our total budget. So we're going to get there.
Nice. Okay. Can you let us in on how Ekiti State's budget has positively impacted the quality of life of its residents?
Okay, so that you can explain in multiple ways, right? So when we're budgeting, we say to ourselves, what are the things we want to achieve, right? So if you look at our 6-point agenda, right? Let's take human capital development, right? What does that mean? We anchor that on 2 broad areas, education and healthcare, right? On the back of one, you need people to be alive to even talk of human capital development, right? So you need people alive and healthy, because if they're unhealthy, then they can't be productive.
Right.
But then the second layer of productivity is skill and proficiency levels, right? Which comes from education. So when we say, okay, human capital development, what is our priority here? Or what are our priorities here? So let's take healthcare, right? We want to improve pediatric coverage, right? We want kids, newborn, infants, to get their full range of vaccination, right? Because we recognize that if you get the full range of vaccination, it's what prevents measles, jaundice, polio, TB, diphtheria, all these diseases, right? That, kill kids. We want to also ensure we reduce maternal mortality. How are we going to do that? We have to get, antenatal care to all pregnant women, right? We have to ensure all pregnant women have access to good delivery systems, which means we have to invest in primary healthcare institutions, right? Because those primary healthcare centers are the closest units to pregnant women, right? So we don't want a pregnant woman driving 3 hours to a specialist hospital. So we said, look, what are we going to do? We're going to take 1 primary healthcare per ward. We'll renovate the physical environment, because people will not come into a place they don't think, if you don't paint the place, regardless of the equipment in there, people aren't going to come.
Yeah.
Right? So it's making the place even look physically attractive. You might say, yes, just, but it's important. 2 is ensuring the basic tools you need for delivery exist, right? Incubators, etc. So if there's a preterm child being born, we can solve all those problems.
Right.
3, which is now on the recurrent side, is saying, what do we need to do to get doctors in place? And if we don't get doctors in place, can we get community health workers or community health officers in place, right, to ensure that there's at least someone who's trained there? So when you see your recurrent budget going up, it's because we are saying we want to ensure pay parity between our doctors and federal doctors. And it's a very interesting thing. I'll tell you what. There are 3 tiers of medical professionals in Nigeria on the public side. There are those who work for the local governments, right, who are healthcare workers under the Primary Healthcare Development Authority, right? As you can imagine, they get paid from local government resources.
Right.
Then there are the guys who work for the state, right, who work for the Health Management Board, right? As you can imagine, they get paid better because they are paid by a bigger brother, right? Then there's the 3rd tier,
Federal.
Who are the federal workers, right? Who are staff of the Ministry of Health working for federal institutions in Ekiti State. Now, do you know what happens? A guy who works for a general hospital, his immediate goal in this life is to be employed by the Federal Medical Center or the Federal University Teaching Hospital, right? So you lose your doctors to those guys, right? So we're not even talking about the ones that writing PLAB and Jackpot into the UK, right? We're talking about just domestically. There's a battle for talent. So we have to increase salaries to ensure we cover those costs. Otherwise, you have these hospitals, you have these equipment, you don't have anybody to do the actual work, right? So you have to think about how quickly can you invest in that? So there's a payroll component to that. Now we then say, okay, we've done all of these things. You can have, babies, you have vaccines. What else do we see as a problem? We look at our data and say, we're seeing a high prevalence of breast cancer, for example, right? So in Ekiti State, breast cancer is easily, by some distance, right, the most prevalent form of cancer, right? So we then have to say, okay, for these tertiary care centers, we need to get, mammogram, capabilities in here so that people can test and detect early, right? So that's what then drives our spend. So a few weeks ago, for example, someone sent me a message on WhatsApp and said, Aki, you guys must be very backward. We saw your governor went to commission a mammogram, machine. Like, is that what the governor should be doing? So I laughed and said, again, it's easy for you to say that. But for us, the reason the governor had to make a song and dance about it is not about the machine. It's about the awareness it creates, right? That this is something that affects a lot of women. So we're using this opportunity to create awareness to say, guys, first, this is a clear and present danger. 2, in a number of places across the state, you can get these things, you can do this test, and if there's a problem, if there's anything sinister, we detect it early, and you don't have to lose your life, right? So that's how you spend to improve human capital development. Right. You then see on the education side, what are your challenges, right? Ekiti today has the 2nd lowest percentage of out-of-school kids in the country, right? Very high literacy rates. But that's because we are always clear to say within 3 kilometers of a settlement, there must be a school, right? So the first thing is ensuring there's coverage, right? Which I think to a large extent we've done. But of course, as you build more schools, there's now more drain on your resources because you have to continue to renovate and ensure that those schools. So of course, over time, many of those schools are you now see dilapidated buildings, etc. So we've now said to ourselves, we're not building a lot of schools anymore. We're only going to build model schools, right? So special schools for our best and brightest. But a lot of our education spend today is now going to be on renovating existing schools and then moving those schools from being generally purely analog schools to digitizing certain components of the curriculum, of the teaching methods, etc. So the spend has shifted. Where 10 years ago, it would have been around building more schools to ensure coverage. It's now more around how do we improve the environment, the teaching methods, the facilities available. And of course, if you put, interactive equipment in a school with a teacher who's very analog, all you're doing is you've put something there that people can come and tweet and, put on social media as nice and fancy, but it doesn't improve the outcomes. Right. So you then have to take the recurrent portion of the spend by saying we're going to invest in training these teachers to ensure they can maximize. Yeah.
That makes sense. That's where U lesson comes in. Just a plug.
U lesson is already in Ekiti State.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's where we get into the picture. All right. You talked a little bit about, initially you talked about how the state meets with the community to understand what they care about in order to set the priorities, right? Have there been any community-driven projects that have been funded by the states that you can share?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll tell you, it's an interesting story, right? And again, this affects my community, right? So there's a road between two towns, one town called Isimbode Ekiti, one town called Ara Ekiti, right? That is a 35-kilometer road, not motorable at all, right? So we went to the town hall, and the guys on both sides, because they belong to two different senatorial districts. So when we went to the south, the guys on the south complained and said, if you did this thing, we will have direct access to the northern part of the state. The guys in the north said, look, we're the food basket of the state, but we can't transport our goods to the south because the artery is cut off, right? So that was an ideal case where two ends of the two sides are saying, look, we want to do this thing, it's a no-brainer. Now today that road is being constructed, right? It's 30% done. And when it's completed, it will, apart from the fact that, I mean, I'm lucky fortuitously, my own house, right, is going to be situated around that corridor, right? But apart from the personal gain I have, because tomorrow when I leave government and I need to maybe sell that house or rent it, someone is going to say to me, this house is now on a major highway. So the price I constructed it for, maybe I'll get like a 2x or 3x return on it. And that goes for anybody who owns real estate on that corridor. So first, there's a real estate appreciation that happens, right? But more importantly, there's a transport of products, right? That means that we can get food cheaper from one end of the state to the other. If you look at why are we investing heavily in roads, people often ask, Ekiti State constantly ranks as the second or third largest, or not largest because that connotes it different, is the second or third most expensive place for food, right? And so food inflation in Ekiti is higher than the national average, right? But we have to bring that down. We know what the factors are driving that. One is that, of course, we receive it quite some, we're equidistant between Lagos and Abuja, right? So we used to be a thoroughfare for northern goods, and some of that stopped with us and went to our markets. With the weakening of the naira, right, it's been cheaper for the SEFA traders to come into Nigeria, right, buy food from Nigeria and take back to the West African sub-region. So a lot of food that should come down south is going outside the country, right? But two, within our state, we've realized that our roads are quite bad, right? And that then increases the cost of production, cost of logistics, and that obviously affects the cost of the goods in the market. So we're intervening, because we can't cover all of the roads at once, we're intervening in what we consider the major arteries, right, for food products and for human transport. So over the next, I'll say, it's not, when you have a problem today, right, people often look at the problem, they forget that it's a symptom of something that's happened 5-10 years ago. Bless you.
Thank you.
And so we have to build today, but you might not see the outcome for another 18 to 24 months. So when people say to us today, hey, you guys, well done, your IGR has grown, out of school kids dropped, your literacy level is very high. I often say, well, thank you for the accolades, but the predecessor government of Dr. Fayemi that I was a part of, right, laid the foundation for the things that you're seeing today, right? It didn't happen overnight, and that's also why there has to be, even if there has to be continuity in vision, right? Because you then can build over a 10 to 15 year or 20-year period.
Right. This has been really insightful so far. I know that we've covered a lot of this beginning part of the budget and then the actual implementation of capital projects, right? Part of the cycle then is this transparency and accountability.
Yes.
Okay. What mechanisms are in place to ensure that?
I'm listening to you.
Yeah, to ensure accountability and transparency.
One thing that you might be accused of, doing like a paid advertorial for us in Ekiti. Because these things you're talking about are things that we excel at, right? So if you take any transparency index, I mean, you can check anyone. I can challenge the room. Just check anyone and show me one where we're not top 3. Just any transparency index, whether it's budgets, whether it's ICANN, just pull one up for me where we're not a top 3 state. You know, I'll wait till I leave. You can keep checking, you know, till your battery dies. You know, why is it so? It's very simple. Yesterday, our Auditor General presented his audit report at the State House of Assembly. I haven't seen that audit report. I'm Commissioner of Finance. Because the audit function first has full independence. There's a board. You know how to, if you want to interfere with audits, all you have to do is not just defund them, right? It's a first line charge. They get their money straight up, like the judiciary. No interference whatsoever from us, right? The commission runs, you know, the audit function fully staffed. So that audit function, our financial statements are all online. Our budget is online. Our budget performance reports are online, right? Anybody who wants to interrogate our numbers is free to do so. Sometimes at great personal cost. I'll tell you a funny story. A week or 2 ago, you know, some people went online and put up, you know, and said, oh, these are people owing car loans to the states, right? And guess who the number 1 person on that list was? No, the governor. And I'll tell you what, because we in Ekiti, we understand that we can't say we are cutting the cost of governance and then we buy cars for ourselves, even though those cars are part of our personal, you know, they are part of our welfare package. It's in your letter, right, that you are entitled to a car. Now, but if you Lesson or Miva or whoever buys you a car, no one's going to complain, right? But we recognize that because we're public servants, we're working with the Commonwealth. If we drive those cars, people are going to say, you see, they've bought big car for themselves. So what we do is we say we don't want to we also don't want to attract like the poor performers who are willing to take any pay structure or any reward system to work for government. We'll say to you, you pay 40% of the cost of your car, the state will pay 60%. Okay. Right? Now that 40% is then deducted from your salary, etc., till you leave government. Now, but the governor resigned early, right? Because he was going to run for office. So the projected deductions could not be met because he had resigned. But when he became governor, he immediately said, come, what are my outstanding? Do I have any issues with you guys? We gave him the list, he paid it off. But the audit had happened before that, right? But nobody went to the Auditor General to say, but that's the governor's name, remove it. Your report is your report. It was put out there, right? Of course, nobody is going to read the second part of it, which is that by the next year's report, he had paid off that thing. It was no longer a factor because that's not a great headline. That doesn't get on Instablog, right? But the point I'm making with that is that we are so transparent that even the number 1 citizen of the state, right, did not say, take my name off a list, right, because it makes me look bad. Right? Now that's the level of, so it's up to the citizens to say, we will interrogate these things and use it for what we want. So everything you want is online. Our procurement records on our procurement portal, every contract we've awarded is available online. And when you know, if I show you who we awarded the contract to, thanks to search.ng and all these things, you can go there and go and see who the particulars of the directors, etc. You know, so there's nothing, we don't think there's anything to hide, right? So all of those things, we're number 1 on any transparency indicator. That's why the room is silent. No one has found anyone where we're not a top 3 state. Do I need to say more?
No, I think you said it all. I think this is good. Do you think, just hearing you talk about it, it's really inspiring. And I'm thinking about this as a Nigerian, not a constituent of Ekiti State. Do you think that this level of transparency and dedication to accountability is possible at a national level?
Look, I think it's not just possible. A lot of it is happening, right? So, there's the Treasury portal, for example, right, that the federal government has, where every payment is uploaded and published. The challenge with this thing is we're not at the level. So development, nation building, I like to say, is an ongoing exercise, right? It has no start or stop date.
Right.
A lot of these things actually exist. These things are available, but we need to interrogate them better, and we need to understand the process. So when the National Assembly is making laws, right, they will always have to put the notice of a public hearing in the newspaper. But they also depend on the fact that how many people can afford to buy those newspapers.
Right.
But one of the things I always say to civil society institutions, organizations, is that you can take yourself and say, I am a legislative advocacy CSO. My job is to ensure every single public hearing, every single law that is being debated, that I share all of these things on digital media today. Social media is a very great space to do this. Like Budget now. Budget has dedicated themselves to transparency and accountability. So you know what I do? Because they're my friends. So I tell my people, Benga has worked with me for many years. He'll tell you. I tell them, I say, you know what, when you guys are doing this thing, I don't want your Onigbinde to drag me on social media. So do this thing in a way that you know that if somebody sees it 100%, it passes every smell test, that it shows you have not been a part of anything, untoward. That's one. But we also drag them, because when they release a result that puts my state in 9th position, where I will show them, I'll say, look, my guys, this, we already had it available. Why are you ranking us so poorly? And when they change the ranking and move us from 9th to 2nd, I say to them, you have changed this thing silently. Come out and apologize, right? Because I also have to watch the watcher. As you are watching me, I'm watching you. But that's how we develop as a society, right? Where everybody's holding the other person accountable. So I think these things exist. Maybe we don't know enough of it. Laws are not made. Look, when the whole Central Bank Act was discussed and debated publicly, they had to drop it because it did not make sense. People said this doesn't make sense as an amendment to an act. So if we're really passionate about these things, right, we will see that there's already enough happening, right? The federal government actually has to disclose a lot. Budgets are disclosed, right? Some people actually go through the fine lines and they start to show, duplications, etc., right? So those things happen. There's still room for more transparency, of course. I mean, we could argue that the National Assembly, for example, needs to disclose a bit more there. But there are also some things that for national security, etc., you will never disclose. It's not disclosed anywhere in the world, right? So, but I think the work for me now is how do we get people to interrogate these things better? Because I go to my state website sometimes and I go to check just the number of downloads, and it's painfully low. You see 20 people downloading our budget, 15 looking at a budget performance report. So I then say, we keep doing these things, but anybody really listening? Are we speaking to ourselves or speaking in an empty room? So, but I don't have the answer to that.
All right. I think this could be a good time to take some questions from our students here and students online. So, if you have any questions here.
All right, there's a question here.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, Honourable. It's still morning.
Yes.
Okay, so blessings to you and discussing budgeting. How could you please tell us if your state fiscal policies target poor budgeting and inclusive budgeting? Because the UN Agenda 2030 matters to everyone. Your budgeting approach doesn't clearly account for SDGs 1 to 17. It's a problem. By the terminal date in 2030, you may not be counted. Listening to you, I saw the pillars, but again, how sure are you next year, 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, that clearly you can see that Ekiti State's budgeting approach targets the extreme poor and the voiceless, because the price of inequality matters a whole lot. Of course, you know that in all parts of Nigeria now, there are a whole lot of persons jobless. There are a whole lot of persons that have taken to crime with the simple reason that they're unemployed, they don't have anything to eat. Yeah. I can confidently tell you that some researchers are worried about governance in the developing climate. So I listened to you. Could you please compactly tell us whether your budgeting approach is rapport and inclusive?
Okay, so sorry. First, my name does not include honorable. My name is Aki or Akintunde. So I prefer to be addressed by the names that were given to me at birth, not the ones that were forced upon me by the role I currently perform. So I mean, a number of things I said earlier will show you that we are very inclusive, right? So like I said earlier, I said, look, we do community engagement sessions, right? We listen to the wisdom of the crowds, you know, and that is as inclusive as you want to get, because that budgeting process, that conversation includes youth, women, people living with disabilities, you know, community representatives. So all of those are people or interest groups, religious groups, whatever groups you can think of, you know, they are part of that budgeting process. Two, I mean, we also spend quite a bit of our resources, you know, on social and social security and social support programs, right? Whether it's, you know, conditional or unconditional grants to the poor and vulnerable, whether it's, you know, things like livelihood support programs, right, to those who are unemployed, you know. So we actually invest very much in a number of these types of programs, right? But ultimately, you see, the thing is, I mean, when we talk about the things that we've talked in our pillars, you know, we've talked about human capital development, education, and healthcare. I don't think that there's anything else that screams inclusion, right, or pro-poor, you know, interventions than education and healthcare. Because if there's anything that democratizes opportunities, it's education, right? So investing heavily in and we have free and compulsory education, right? In fact, I am against paying WAEC fees for students, right? Because I think there's an incentive for parents not to be as engaged, right, with the performance of their kids when they are not the ones bearing a part of the cost, right? But I'm in the minority and I shut my mouth, right? So we pay it, right? But I'm saying that as a state, and I'll you know what, I'll be a bit contrarian, right? So, you know, people come and start to reel out SDGs to me, right? And I'm like, you know what, we'll do what's best for us. Now, if it aligns with SDGs, fine, because we're the Millennium Development Goals today, right? That's true. Tomorrow, someone else becomes the UN Secretary General. He creates their own agenda. Then all of you will turn again, like headless sheep, you know, and face a new set of goals, right? So these goals have not done very much, right, for developing people, right? And we can get stuck in an aid development agenda trap, where every 5 years somebody is redefining something, right? The person who redefines the goal, you are not in the room when the goals are set, right? And then you have to now say, oh, you know, we want to, by 2030, we want to adopt XYZ. You know what's going to happen in 2026? Someone is going to look at those goals and say, these things are not achievable. Let's quickly change it before 2030 comes. So we will set the goals that help us as Ekiti. I have defined it to you as a vision of shared prosperity, right? The concept of shared prosperity is already a concept of inclusion and lifting people out of poverty, right? Because you can't share prosperity if people are poor. You know, so we're very clear about reducing inequality. And what are we doing? Things like focusing on agriculture and food security, helping to ensure that people have arable land to cultivate, helping to ensure that people have access to quality seeds and inputs, helping to ensure that we start to increase irrigation support. I mean, we're spending quite a ton of money on a portable water supply program because we believe that, look, before we even go into healthcare, etc., preventing ill health starts with people having access to clean water, right? So those are things that are pro-poor, you know, inclusive, you know, expenses, you know. So across the spectrum, I spoke about broadband penetration. we took the right-of-way tariff from 5,000 naira per linear meter to the government, to the NEC agreed 145 naira per linear meter. And we even said to the providers that we will take out that 145 naira if you delivered the broadband and you give us some social responsibility, supply. Now, what does that do? It means that in my community, in Ekiti, I remember in 2019, when I went there, I had 2G access, right? I couldn't use WhatsApp, right? There was only one place where you could use WhatsApp.
Wow.
Yeah, or you could load Facebook. Now, today, 4.5 years later, right, there's no part of the state, right, that doesn't have access to 4G, right? So again, when you create those opportunities, you are democratizing opportunities for your most vulnerable, for the largest, group of people that require, government support. At the end of the day, our job as government, right, is to ensure that we democratize opportunities for people, and that's the principle of our development plan. So if you look at our development plan, right, you will see that all of it is very inclusive, all of it is pro-poor. The only thing that I always push back against is saying that let's measure ourselves against some development goals, right, that might not completely align with our own aspirations as a people.
Thank you.
We'll take some from online. Go ahead, Cody.
Good morning, Aki.
Good morning.
Yeah, so this question is from Michael here, a student of public policy and administration here. And his question is on education. Is there a plan to improve the curriculum to produce more STEM professionals and entrepreneurs to have direct impact on the economy? And the second question would be, how are you combating poaching of your talents? Just as you mentioned, those that are jackpine and the others that are moving to higher institutions that pay better.
So the first point, and I think it's also one of the constraints I find with the federation and our concept of federalism. So there are certain things, for example, like curriculum, right, design, that we as a state simply do not have control over.
Right.
States don't. So as a state, we don't have, one state will not control the curriculum. So there are some things that states don't have control over, and we have to work within, the ambit of the Federal Ministry of Education, right? But what we're trying to do, for example, for things like improving, STEM outcomes, we've started to pay, for, digital literacy, digital skills acquisition programs, privately, right? We're building out Ekiti Knowledge Zone, which is our special economic zone focused on, the digital economy. It's from a land, so people, when I talk about Ekiti Knowledge Zone, people always get excited from the land, building, developing, like a new city. But for me, that's not the attraction. It's not in the physical infrastructure. It's not in the buildings and the shiny buildings and the roads. It's in the programs we're going to now see, the centers of excellence that we're building in the universities in Ekiti. Because the concept and the hypothesis for us is, look, we're highly literate people, right? Well educated. We are far from Lagos, right? We're 290 kilometers from Lagos. So if you are citing an industry, a manufacturing plant, you're better off in Ogun or your state. So we know where we have, comparative disadvantages. But we think that in the service economy, where distance is not a barrier, right? Where we've already invested in broadband, we have generally smart people. We can now start to train those people to take up jobs, right? And so what we are hoping for is at some point, Miva will then come and sit in Ekiti Knowledge Zone, right? Because it's a place where innovation thrives, right? And it's a perfect place for an institution like this, So that's what we're building, today. And that's why we're investing in, digital natives as an add-on, but we can't affect the curriculum. To your second point, even the knowledge zone also answers that question, right? Because we're thinking to ourselves, and I'll tell you my personal story, right? My father was very lucky, right? He just won the luck of the draw because his father and uncle were one of the first set of people to go to secondary school in Ekiti State. And then they ended up going to university and, his uncle ended up moving to Lagos and my father as a child went to school in Lagos, right? But they all came back to high school in Ekiti, right? So I always joke with them that, you guys you went to Grange and Corona and all these places, but when it was time to go to high school, they all brought them back to Christ School. Now, I went to international school, University of Lagos, and then my father said to me, when I left primary school, he said that, you have a chance to be a third generation Christ School. I told him, no way. So I broke the trend, sadly. I mean, if I knew then what I know now, I might have ended up going there. But the point I'm making is that school came because someone left the UK, right, and said, I'm going to come and set up a school. When he came to Nigeria, they didn't come to Lagos. They went to Ado Ekiti for whatever reason to set up Christ School. You see these professors per capita thing, right? 90% of them came from Christ School. Right? That's one. So, I want to put it in context. That's one secondary school. So when you think about some of Nigeria's foremost historians, people like Akintunde Oyebode, right? People like J.F. Adeajayi, Christ School. One secondary school. So we're very keen to say, look, our role, I am where I am today because my father was on the right side of the draw. If his parents had not gone to school, there's nothing that differentiates me from the guy in Ekiti today, right now in this moment, sitting down, playing drafts, right? And when you're driving past, asking you to give them money. So our whole thesis is that, look, if we invest in education and we create this special economic zone for these kinds of people, there's no reason why the person thinks that my prosperity is in Lagos or is in the United Kingdom, right? Because as long as we're able to create enough of a decent opportunity, even if they're not going to get paid as much, but if they get enough to pay them, to give them a chance to have a decent life, they're not going to leave. So that's the investment we're making to keep talent. Because again, the other thing is that we can't, this salary increase, right, to retain people in government is a race to the bottom, right? Again, now we're going to confront a minimum wage discussion, right? We always say to people, we don't begrudge your aspirations for a living wage, right? But we also, as the employer, must be able to pay. So we're not going to be employing more people as government, right? But we are going to retain the ones we have because we'll train them, we'll pay them parity, we'll ensure pay parity with their counterparts federally, but we're not going to be the ones to deepen that pool. So that pool is going to be deepened by the private sector, who hopefully come to Ekiti, because they've seen some of the developments we've made in infrastructure, they've seen the developments we've made in increasing the supply of talent, in the state.
All right, and I have one more question from here. And the question is, how are you instilling a culture of competence in your civil service?
Okay, good question. Very good question. It's an interesting conversation because we have, I think first, I'll say this very clearly. I think that the civil service is often underrated, right, in most places. So our view of the civil service is like some very backward people, who inhibit growth. I think that that's quite far from the truth. There's room for improvement, but I think that when I engage the public servants in Ekiti, and I've worked in 2 states and in Lagos, those people are some of the best people you'll find anywhere, right? It's really about ensuring that quality at the top now permeates all the way down. The first thing is obviously you have to make the entry process meritocratic, right? And that's something that we do now. So for example, our head of service today, right, is head of service because she came first in an exam, an assessment for the 4 or 5 most senior permanent secretaries in the state. It's not because she's anyone's preferred candidate. She came first. To become a permanent secretary, you have to write an exam. You have to pass the exam, right? What we now need to institute, so we've been able to do it at the top tier to ensure only the best. What we now have to do is lower down, right? Where you find there's a problem is that people get promoted regardless of performance.
Right.
Promotion is a function of duration of stay at a grade level. So effectively, if you manage to stay alive, right? Because you're also not going to get fired, right? Because the process of firing someone has multiple layers, in my opinion, that's designed to prevent it from happening, right? So you then have to say promotion has to be a function of passing an assessment and appraisals, not just staying in the role, right? I think that for me is the single biggest change, right, to the reward system that to allow us get the best people. You also have to understand your constraints, right? And I always use an example of someone that I'm very fond of till tomorrow, you know, Chief Bisi Akande, when he was governor of Osun State. He came in as governor with the best intention. And he said, we need to right-size this public service, right? I know it might be before many of you's time here, but he did that with tremendous effectiveness. You know what happened in 2002? He was running against a gentleman called Olagunsoye Oyinlola. You know what he did? He campaigned and said, Bisi Akande is sacking all of you people. If you want more of you to be sacked, vote for him again. If you vote for me, I'll not only return those of you he has sacked, I will even employ more of you. I mean, I'm sure you don't even need to check Wikipedia to know what happened in that election, right? So I always say to myself, and in sessions like this, that Baba Akande's policy was the right one, right? From a macroeconomic fiscal perspective, right? But from a socio-political perspective, it's the last thing you want to do, because not only were the reforms rolled back, they ended up in a much worse off position than when he had started. So you've got to recognize your constraint is you're not getting rid of anybody. We are right-sizing people and we're training people to ensure that they perform optimally, right? So that even if you have a 20% bulge in your workforce, right, your focus can't be to cut that bulge. Your focus is improving the productivity of the whole, where even though you are carrying a bit of a bulge, it's a more productive bulge. You know, it's a compromise, right? Yeah. Otherwise, you'll never win an election. I mean, you might win one in this room, but sadly, you're not enough to make a councillor, not to talk of a local government chairman.
Fair enough. All right, we have a question in the back.
So I want to ask, what has Ekiti State done after 8 years and both states? And I know every state is unique, but what do you advise for that submission? The areas that are not fit out, to promote 8 years and other states. Then, the second question is, does Ekiti State have a functioning social register? Because when you want to make targeted interventions, how does this funds get supposed to?
Okay, again, you know, thank you very much. Free adverts space. So I set up the investment promotion agency in Ekiti. And I think the first thing is you must have a governor who has the vision to say, we're going to prioritize foreign direct investment, but just not foreign direct investment, just investment, whether domestic or foreign, right? All capital, you know, there's nothing that says it's foreign or domestic. It's just attracting capital to your state. To do that, you need to be clear that there has to be a central, a coordinating office, where if investors have a question, they go there, right? And also to ensure that you don't engage with too many people, right? Someone who is constantly looking at the space and saying, where is it? What are the pain points for investors? What can we do better? You know, how do we improve the ease of doing business, right? If there's a complaint, how do we ensure it is addressed, right? Because this thing is a, you know, people always, there's herd mentality. If they think something is working and somebody comes to your state, every other person is going to be like, why is that person going to Ekiti? There must be something there. So I'll tell you, when Promasidor came and took over our dairy farm in Ikun, I got a truckload of requests from other people saying, you know, let's talk, because they're like, if Promasidor is going to Ekiti, then there must be serious people, right? So that's the one thing. Just ensure that you have a dedicated function of cabinet rank, not some lower level role where the person can't see the governor in 1 year, right? Of cabinet rank, where you as governor, you are first the biggest salesman for your state, right? So if you tell my governor today that, there's this big investor or someone is setting up their factory, he will go there and ask you, what are your problems? Right? He's not going to do that ad infinitum. But he needs to do that 5 or 6 times to set the tone, where everybody in government realizes that this guy is passionate about this thing. Got a lot of eye service in government. When they know that the governor is passionate about this, then everybody will default to it. So you have to pick those things because you can't use them. And for me, investment is one area. But the problem with investment and why Nigeria's FDI numbers are understated, in my opinion, is that a lot of it goes through a gray corridor. So I'll give you an example. I went to see a school that was just built in Ekiti. Fantastic school. Primary, secondary school. The guy lives in America, right? All that capital came from the US, right? He's not going to show up on any FDI radar, right? No, because it's all through informal flows, right? It's all through informal flows. Then 2, when the capital comes in, it's a small technical issue where the way we record these things is based on the certificate of capital importation that was registered. Now, MTN might be importing capital to work in Adamawa State, but MTN's headquarters is in Lagos. So that's why Lagos always gets an outsized share of those numbers. It will always get an outsized share, by the way, but maybe it's not 99%, maybe it's 50%, right? So there's a lot more capital going out across the states, but as a country, that's one thing you also need to understand. You cannot outmaneuver your country limitation. So for example, when we had an inflexible FX regime, it was impossible to attract capital because people said, if I bring money into this country, I don't see a way to get it out. Right. So for example, the exchange rate devaluation that we've had to take on board is in my opinion, is a necessary bitter pill, right, to swallow, right, to ensure that we become again an attractive destination for capital. And we become an export-focused economy. If you are a cocoa farmer, trust me, you will not be complaining about exchange rates. You won't. They are all buying new cars, oh. You understand? If you go to Ileoluji today, the farmers, they are very happy, oh. When you are saying, $1.16, the guy is thinking cocoa exports, 1.6, right? So if we're an export-focused economy, right, it switches how we think about exchange rate. The reason every Nigerian is a macroeconomist when it comes to exchange rate is because we're a very import-dependent society, right? But imagine you were a tourism destination, a resort in Nigeria that people come from out of the country to use, right? You won't be worried that there's a devaluation because it allows you to. So my big thing with that issue, for example, I know that we've pivoted to a different conversation, is when you devalue, when your currency devalues, you've got to also build export discipline, right? So you've got to say, for people exporting goods out of Nigeria, we need to make it very easy for them to do that, right? Now, that's what also helps the FDI conversation, because when people can come and set up shop here, it's cheaper to operate here. And I'll give you an example. When I was at LSCTF, we attracted a company called Tech Experts to come work in Nigeria. I don't know if any of you know them. They are an outsourcing company who exclusively serve Microsoft, right? I remember a guy came to me at the launch of that thing, and it was such a moment for me because it was like, Chief, you've changed my life. And I was like, what did I do? He says, I saw your tweets about this thing, right? And I just applied. And I got the job. And this was 5 years ago, and he was being paid 300,000 naira, right? And he said when he got his first paycheck, his mom said, I have to come to that office you're working in because I think you're not doing fraud, right? But do you know why Tech Experts could pay 300K? Because when you adjust for the dollar, it's still cheaper than what they are paying in Vietnam, right? Because as Vietnam has moved up to become a middle-income country, the cost of labor has gone up. Right. So those are the kind of things that you now say, how do we become an outsourcing outpost for the world, right? And so you as a Nigerian, you don't care because you're like, well, it's still marked to the dollar. I earn more naira, I don't mind, right? So those are the things that we have to think about with FDIs. Now, the second point around social register, that one is, we have not only a comprehensive social register, we have even a rapid register, right? Which we can update at short notice. So, the thing is, when people always talk about these registers and say, are these registers legit? Are they? First, we go in there and we do the living standards assessment, right? We go into the houses. Our enumerators go in there and say, do you have a color television? Do you have this? You have that? Do you have DSTV? Do you have GoTV? Or do you just have a radio? You know, do you have Okada? Do you have, you know, air conditioning, etc., right? Do you cook with, you know, a clean stove, or you use firewood? You know, there are all these indicators that we use, right? A bunch of them. Then we say, we'll aggregate all of these and go to the town hall meeting and say, these are the people in your community who we think are the poorest. So maybe you went to hide your television. Someone is going to be like, that guy has TV, right? So it's a painstaking exercise. So of course, you can imagine you can't do it every day because it's very expensive. So you do that once in 5 years, right? But regularly you refresh it, right? And you go back and just say, let's sense check these things. And if there's one community where the error margin, right, is outside of norm, then you do it for that community, right? And so that's how we build the rapid registers. So depending on the quantum of what we want to do, we can either default to our social register or use the rapid register. Now, what we also get is for communities, for clusters, not individuals, we actually go to the telcos and we ask them for anonymized data and say, you know, what's the ARPU? What's the average revenue per user, right, in these communities? So when you give it to us on a community level, we can also zone in on a community and say, this is where our poorest people live. Because the truth is that poor people tend to band together, right? So we also can go to individual communities and say, okay, in Ekiti, these are the 10 poorest communities because they have the lowest ARPU, they have the lowest vaccine coverage, you know, they have the lowest in terms of, you know, leading indicators. They have the highest, you know, pollution indicators, right? So we then go into those communities and specifically target those communities for rapid intervention. So every social intervention we do is actually based on a register. The only thing that why it's very difficult to push back is you also cannot put people at risk because you want to prove that money is going to them to start to publish their names, right? Because what you find next is that they then become targets for, you know, all sorts of bad actors.
Okay, in the interest of time, we'll take one more question from yeah.
What will the in the budgeting process, particularly in cases where expenditures are made without proper authorization?
So, you know, the thing with the expend, you know, it's very difficult today to expend without proper authorization, right? You know, for example, before a payment, so, you know, I always say that when they go, I remember when Governor Fashola said, you know, they asked him something, said, look, I don't sign checks, right? I mean, people always think that the governor is this all-conquering, you know, individual. But the reality is that if someone wants to break the law, he needs his commissioner of finance, right, to allow him to do it. He needs the accountant general to allow that happen. He needs the auditor general to allow that happen. Now, all those people, none of them has immunity. You understand? As I'm speaking to you here now, there's nothing stopping those guys in the red vest from coming to arrest me. You think I don't know that? So if a governor says to me, go and do X, Y, Z, I'm going to look at him and say, chief, when the thing hits the fan, right? You know, nobody can come to hold you now. You know, I'm the one whose wife will be bringing beans, and that's if she even agrees. I know my own wife; she won't even bring anything to me. You know, so you've got to think to yourself and say, hey, you know, is this thing worth, you know, treading this line? So it's impossible because someone has to authorize the payment, right? You can't pay effectively without an authorization of the payment. Now, if you think about expenditure process, it ends with the accountant general saying this payment voucher is good to be paid, and then an instruction goes to the bank. Before that happens, it has to come to me, right? It has to go through procurement. For expenses of a certain amount, it has to go through the state tenders board. For an even higher amount, it has to go through the state executive council, right? There are multiple authorization levels, right? So, you know, this is not like where you just say someone just punches something in and says, hey, it's done. Even when the payments are being made electronically, all these people have to authorize. So there's a chain of command, right, for every payment. Now, you might ask, the question that people are well within their rights to ask is not really about unauthorized payments, about value for money, right? It's about, is this the best way to spend this 1 billion naira, right? So, you know, someone says to me today, for example, and says, hey, you know, Nigeria, hungry, etc., we want to buy a presidential jet, right? You know, at face value, sounds like a terrible idea, right? Now, I don't know if it's a terrible idea or not, but it can be interrogated further. Because first, if you ask yourself, if the president of the country is going to travel X number of times, etc., he's going to hire a plane, how much is that going to cost? If you amortize the lifetime of that jet, maintenance and, you know, capex, how much does it cost? If you're getting something that was, you know, forfeited by someone who was owing a bank, you know, which I understand is what we're trying to do, you know, and you're buying it at effectively 30% of the cost,
Right.
you know, it's already significantly discounted. There needs to be more insights, right? And a deeper discussion about, is this the right time to spend this amount? And I always give my own state example, right? You know, and those of you who follow me on Twitter will see that every now and again I get, you know, spanked by what people call haters, you know. I don't actually, I think it's very interesting why people call them haters. I always like it when people antagonize me on Twitter. It's one of my best moments. Yeah, no, I love it, I'm telling you. It's so nice.
Okay.
But they always come to me and say, hey, you know, they'll pull out a tweet from 2014 and say, you were against an airport in your state, right? But now you're in the government and the government is building an airport, right? And is that the best use of money? And I always say, look, guys, it's a very legitimate question to ask, right? But I work for a government, my personal views don't really count. Am I an airport skeptic? I will always be one. Always. But do I understand the arguments of those who are proponents of an airport in every state? I understand the arguments. Now, part of the argument for us is, look, we started building that airport in 2019, right? We've completed it now, and we're going through civil aviation certification. Ballpark, by the time we finish, that airport would have cost us about 35 billion naira. Right? It's a lot of money, right? We were trying to reconstruct Ado-Akure Highway. It's a federal road. To reconstruct that road, all 40 kilometers of it, at the time cost us 37 billion. So we had to abandon it. Because we're rebuilding the road, right, through what is a fairly difficult terrain. We built a 6-kilometer road that connects Ado-Ekiti to the next town in. We had to blast through 4 kilometers of igneous formations to build that road. It cost us 9 billion naira to build that road. If we're building that road today, it will cost us 15. So to construct roads, just trying to explain to people, to construct roads, it's not millions of naira, it's billions of naira to construct roads. Now, we then took a decision and said, instead of putting this money in a federal road, let the federal government take care of its road. We'll build our own airport. Right? Now, that airport will not be optimal for another 5 years. But if we wait 5 years to build it, today, any state that wants to start that project today, to the quality of what we built, will spend double. 65 billion. Easily. To build an airport with a Category 4 runway. So we took a decision that we're going to build this airport today for the future that we cannot see. We'll build it the runway to spec that a 747 can land there. Now, my pushback always was, do you have the cargo to fill a 747? Of course not, right? But the question that I got asked is that, do you not want to build an Ekiti where we can fill that cargo load, right? So we're going to start that airport with maybe 2 flights every other day, right? But it will grow because the biggest driver, I always say your biggest risk is non-consumption. You can easily say nobody in this community can afford to buy a car. But you haven't put a road there, right? It's the same thing we said about mobile phones, right? Now the phones are here. Your driver, your security guard, he has 2. You know? Exactly. David Mark infamously said that telephone is not for the poor. Well, guess what? He's alive to see it today. Telephone is for the poor. He himself now has the same number of phones as his driver. So for me, the thing is about, look, what's the value for money, right? How do we interrogate our spend? Do we have a debate about it? You know, so when we ended up building an airport in Ekiti, but trust me, that thing was heavily debated. And I know what side of the debate I stood on, right? But today, I'm I'm humble enough to say, guys, you know what? In 2014, when I said Ekiti does not need an airport on Twitter, Akure Airport was doing 1 flight a week. Right? Today, the airport is doing 2 flights a day. Right? So if we do the numbers, right, it's effectively like a 40x increase. Right? But half of that traffic is our traffic on Ekiti State. So is it the best spend? Maybe not. Because, you know, you've moved from 1 flight a week, one way, right, to one that now does a round trip every day. And 2 people now do that round trip every day, right? So even if we say we're getting 1 flight a day in Ekiti, right, it's situated next to a knowledge zone. It's situated next to Afe Babalola University, a multi-specialist hospital, right? It's situated next to federal institutions. So for me, I'll say, you know what? There are many, it's not the best way to spend it, but we could have spent it on a lot worse options, right? And today, there are people who are going to be 10, 15 years from now saying those guys were visionary, right? Because again, these places we look at, right? If you think about JFK, LaGuardia, you know, when these airports were built to that scope, the traffic wasn't there. So you have to take you've got to take some big bets. Now, we're not saying now spend all your money on big bets, right? But every now and again as a state, we're going to say, you know what, we're going to bet on one thing. It might be an airport today, it might be a special economic zone tomorrow. And I think that's my last point on budgeting, right? You can't always budget on business as usual, right? It's like a business, it's like a company. If you think about the most transformative companies in the world, right? If you think about Amazon as a company, right? You know, Jeff Bezos is like, you guys are still selling books, right? I'm thinking about something else, completely different. And he's happy to take 10 or 12 people and say, you know what, you guys, forget about what is today's cash cow, right? I'm thinking about what is tomorrow's cash cow. Because he's constantly thinking, I don't want to be Kodak, right? I don't want to be caught in a storm unprepared, right? And that's how you have to think about it in government as well. Like, you can get lost in spending your budgeting resources on just ensuring you keep the lights on, right? But you're going to be there 20 years later, still keeping the lights on, you know, and you've got to think about what is the future, you know, what is going to enable unborn children compete against their peers in other times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ake. I think where you've landed is a really good place for us to close this out with this question that our students can kind of take away from this conversation. What are, I guess, some key takeaways that our students can apply to their understanding of public finance, and how can they use the knowledge to contribute to developing their own states, their own community?
Okay, so I think the thing about public finance is the first thing you've got to understand is discipline, right? If you lack discipline, someone is going to pay for it, right? In the revolving cycles and the, you know, short-term nature of Nigeria's politics, where you have a 4-year guaranteed term as governor or president, it's important to always remember that you can't, nation building is an unending exercise, right? You can't be too impatient, and then by doing so, you mortgage the future that you won't be a part of. You know, so I think that for me is always the first lesson to say, look, we must moderate our appetites, right? To ensure that we live within our means, right? I think the second thing is to always try to reflect on what is the broad goal, right? And how does our spend align with that broad goal? You know, sometimes, again, back to discipline, you know, someone just comes and says, hey, we need to intervene here. We need to do this. We need to do that, right? You must almost think about it like you would if you're a parent, right? You know, where your kid wants multiple things, but you as the parent has a view from the mountaintop and realizes that we have to prioritize your education. We have to prioritize your healthcare. We have to prioritize your nutrition, right? These are the things that are most important, you know, not a new PlayStation, right? However you agitate and cry for it, it might not be the best thing for you. So it's also saying, look, how do we maximize value, right, to the people? And I think finally, you know, it's when you're in a room or when you're in public service, right, you must always remember with some humility. It's very difficult, you know, to retain some of that humility because there are people, you know, sirens, you know, there's the paraphernalia of office that makes you forget that you are just one person, you know. And I always say that, if you are in a role where either you are a leader or you are close to a leader, if you are the leader, you must recognize that you must have that person who, like the Romans, you will say to Brutus, I be to Caesar, that you are but a man, even though you wear this armor, you are cloaked in this armor, you are still one person. Don't forget that. So you must have that thing where you recognize that, look, at the end of the day, it's an incredible honor, right, to have an opportunity to shape the lives of millions of people, right? And you mustn't take it for granted. So you must think about it and say, what, this tour of duty is going to end, right? How do I want to be remembered? What is the legacy I want to leave behind? Is it one of being forgettable, right? Is it one where people will thank God that you've gone, or is it one where people will be truly, clear? And it doesn't have to be within even your lifetime. I always use an example of Prime Minister John Major. I mean, not probably the most elegant or distinguished British PM, but if you think about UK sports, right? He made a very unpopular decision at the time and devoted the lottery taxes and proceeds to a sports excellence program, right? And that program was so rigorous that if you were not developing champions, they cut your funding, they take it somewhere else. 20 years after he left office, the United Kingdom came second or third in the last Olympics. It was their best ever performance by a country mile, right? That elite sports program, people could trace it to his policies 20 years ago. Because guess what? If you are going to make an Olympic champion, it's not when the person is 16, right? It's when the child is 3, right? So the best footballers today, they've been playing. Carlos Alcaraz, he won Wimbledon on Sunday. It's not what he did last week, it's what he's been doing since he was 5, right? And that's how governance is. So you must have the conviction to say, I will invest in the future, even if nobody acknowledges my role in this thing. I'm taking the best decision for the future of the entity that I've been given, the privilege of guarding.
Thank you so much, Aki.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been such an insightful conversation, very interesting for me, even personally. So thank you so much for taking some time from your busy schedule to be here with us today. I'm going to hand it over to the VC to give some closing remarks, vote of thanks, and then we can close out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. This has been an impactful, insightful, and excellent masterclass. We've been here for almost going to 2 hours, and it's still exciting. So I want to say thank you to everyone that has participated. And let me quickly say some things I've learned here. First is about we need to plan, and not just plan for short time period. Plan for 30 years. And for our students, look, where do you want to be in the next 5 years? Where do you want to be in the next 10 years? Even in 20 years, even 30 years, like Ekiti State has been planning, so you should start planning that. And also, Honourable said we should not follow him down, but whoever honor is due to, we should give. So, Honourable Commissioner, you have also said that there is huge pool or there's huge demand for talent. And my students, I want you to be talented. Find ways to ensure that you are talented. In whatever you do, be an expert. That's what our masterclass presenter said today. You need to do that. So, to our masterclass presenter, I like your passion, your drive, your commitment, and even cerebral. You are talking about sport, about different things, and even native intelligence. So thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
And on behalf of our chancellor, staff, members, students, we want to say thank you for coming. We appreciate you.